The sound of a whip cracked through the air, followed by a muffled sob. In the small, dimly lit cabin on the outskirts of Willow Creek, Grace Porter bit down hard on her lip until she tasted blood, trying desperately to stifle her cries. Her husband Frank's voice was low and menacing in her ear. "What did I tell you about making noise, woman? No one wants to hear your pathetic weeping." It was 1878, and Grace had been married to Frank Porter for 3 years, 3 years that felt like an eternity. She had married him at 18, believing his promises of a good life together in the Wyoming Territory. Now, at 21, her golden brown hair hung limp around her face, and her once bright hazel eyes had dulled with fear and resignation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she clutched her side where his boot had connected moments earlier. "The baby. I was just worried about the baby." Frank's face contorted with rage. "There ain't no baby anymore, is there? Lost it because you're weak. And if I hear you crying over it one more time—" He didn't finish his threat, just grabbed his hat and stormed out of the cabin, the door slamming behind him. Grace curled into herself on the rough wooden floor, allowing the tears to flow silently now that she was alone. She had lost their unborn child 2 weeks ago, and Frank had shown no grief, only disgust at her failure. The doctor had said she might never conceive again after the complications, and Frank had been increasingly violent since receiving the news. The cabin walls seemed to close in around her as dusk settled outside. Soon Frank would return, likely drunk from the saloon in town, and the cycle would begin again. She couldn't survive another night like this. With shaking hands, Grace pulled herself up from the floor and moved toward the small trunk that contained her few belongings. She worked quickly, gathering what little she could carry: a dress, a shawl, the small silver locket her mother had given her before she died. Frank had taken most of her possessions and sold them over the years, claiming they needed the money for his gambling debts. As night fell, Grace slipped out of the cabin and into the darkness. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to escape. The nearest town beyond Willow Creek was Riverdale, nearly 20 miles away. If she could make it there, perhaps she could find work, or at least temporary shelter. The night was cold, the spring air still carrying winter's bite. Grace pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked as quickly as her bruised body would allow. Each step sent pain radiating through her ribs, but she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that staying meant certain death, whether by Frank's hand or by her own despair. By dawn, Grace had covered less than half the distance to Riverdale. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and hunger gnawed at her empty stomach. She hadn't dared stop during the night, terrified that Frank would discover her absence and come searching. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the trees, she paused near a small creek to drink and rest momentarily. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her scrambling to her feet. Heart pounding, she looked frantically for somewhere to hide, but the sparse spring vegetation offered little cover. The horse and rider came into view around a bend in the trail, and Grace froze, like a rabbit sensing a predator. The rider was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He wore a dusty trail coat and had the unmistakable air of someone who had spent years in the saddle. A cowboy, not from these parts; she would have recognized him otherwise. He pulled his horse to a stop when he spotted her, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in her appearance: the bruised face, the way she held herself as if every movement caused pain. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep but gentle, nothing like Frank's harsh tones. "Are you all right?" Grace stood silent, unable to find her voice. No one had asked about her well-being in so long. The stranger dismounted slowly, keeping his distance as if he understood her fear. "My name's Samuel Oakley. I'm heading to Riverdale to meet up with a cattle drive." He studied her face, his blue eyes filled with quiet concern. "You look like you could use some help." Grace took a step back. I'm fine, she said automatically, the lie she had told so many times to neighbors who occasionally noticed her bruises. Just traveling. Samuel's gaze moved to the dirt path behind her. On foot? Alone? He glanced at the sun, now climbing higher in the eastern sky. That's a dangerous proposition in these parts, madam. I don't have much choice, Grace whispered, her voice breaking. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. At least take some food. I've got jerky and hardtack. Not much of a meal, but it'll keep you going. The simple kindness nearly undid her. Grace's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked back, remembering all too well the punishment for crying. But a single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. Thank you, she managed, reaching for the offered food with trembling hands. Samuel's expression darkened as he noticed the bruises on her wrists where Frank had gripped her the night before. Someone hurt you, he said. It wasn't a question. Grace said nothing, her gaze dropping to the ground. You're running from him, Samuel continued quietly. Your husband? A small nod was all she could manage. Samuel sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. I can't leave you out here alone. Riverdale's still a good 10 miles off, and there are mountain lions in these parts. Not to mention less savory types than myself who might come along. I can't go back, Grace said, panic rising in her voice. He'll kill me this time. I'm not suggesting you go back, Samuel said firmly. I'm offering to take you to Riverdale. My horse can carry us both, and we'd be there by midday. Grace hesitated, weighing her limited options. Trust this stranger or continue alone, exhausted and vulnerable. Something in his steady gaze gave her a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. All right, she said finally. Thank you. Samuel helped her onto his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, before mounting behind her. He was careful not to touch her more than necessary, maintaining a respectful distance as much as the shared saddle allowed. As they rode, Samuel kept his conversation light, not pressing her for details she wasn't ready to share. He told her about the cattle drive he was joining, how they would be taking 2,000 head of cattle from Wyoming to Kansas City. Been doing this work since I was 16, he explained. Started as a wrangler, worked my way up to trail boss on some drives. This one I'm just hired on as an experienced hand. The pay's good, and I like the freedom of it. Grace listened, finding comfort in the rumble of his voice and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something that might have been hope. They reached Riverdale shortly after noon, the small town bustling with more activity than Grace had seen in years. Willow Creek had been little more than a few buildings clustered around a single dirt street, but Riverdale had several blocks of businesses, a proper church, and what appeared to be a small hotel. Samuel guided his horse to a hitching post outside a weathered building with a sign that read, Widow Mitchell's Boarding House. He dismounted and helped Grace down, steadying her when her legs threatened to give way after the long ride. Mrs. Mitchell's a good woman, he explained. Takes in folks who need a place to stay. Doesn't ask too many questions. The boarding house was modest but clean, with simple furnishings and the smell of something savory cooking in the kitchen. The widow herself was a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Samuel Oakley, she said with a hint of a smile. Been wondering when you'd pass through again. And who's this you've brought with you? This is Miss Grace, Samuel said, not giving her full name, which Grace appreciated. She's in need of lodging and perhaps employment, if you know of anything suitable. Mrs. Mitchell's eyes softened as they took in Grace's bruised face and thin frame. I might have a room available, she said, and as it happens, I could use some help with the cooking and cleaning around here. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce. Grace's shoulders sagged with relief. I can cook and clean, she said quickly. And I can sew too, if that's helpful. That would be helpful indeed. Mrs. Mitchell nodded. But first, you look like you could use a hot meal and some rest. Come on back to the kitchen. Samuel cleared his throat. I should be on my way. The trail boss will be expecting me. He turned to Grace, his expression serious. Will you be all right here? Grace nodded, overwhelmed by his kindness. Yes. Thank you. For everything. Take care of yourself, Miss Grace, he said softly, then turned to Mrs. Mitchell. I'll settle her first week's board before I go. Before Grace could protest, he had followed Mrs. Mitchell to her small office at the front of the house, returning moments later with his business concluded. The cattle drive should take about 2 months, Samuel said as he prepared to leave. I'll stop by when we return, if that's all right. Just to make sure you're getting along fine. That's very kind of you, Grace replied, surprised by the offer and by the small flutter of anticipation it stirred within her. After Samuel departed, Mrs. Mitchell showed Grace to a small but clean room on the second floor. Get some rest, the older woman advised. We'll talk more about arrangements later. Alone in the room, Grace sank onto the narrow bed, the events of the past 24 hours washing over her. For the first time in years, she had made a decision for herself, taken a risk for her own survival. And somehow, against all odds, she had found kindness from strangers when she needed it most. She allowed herself to cry then, not the silent tears of fear and pain that had become her habit, but tears of relief and the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps here, in this new place, she could begin to rebuild some semblance of a life. The weeks that followed fell into a steady rhythm. Grace worked hard at the boarding house, cooking meals, cleaning rooms, and mending linens. Mrs. Mitchell was firm but fair, and the other boarders, mostly traveling salesmen or workers passing through, were respectful, perhaps deterred by Mrs. Mitchell's watchful eye. Grace's body slowly healed, the bruises fading from her skin, though the memories remained. She kept to herself mostly, speaking only when necessary, still flinching at sudden movements or raised voices. But gradually, as days passed without violence or fear, something within her began to uncoil, like a flower tentatively opening after a long winter. A month into her stay, as she was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house, the sound of approaching horses made her freeze. 3 riders came into view, and her heart stopped when she recognized the one in the lead, Frank Porter, his face twisted in a scowl as his eyes locked on her. There you are, you ungrateful whore, he snarled, dismounting and striding toward her. The 2 men with him, cronies from the saloon in Willow Creek, remained on their horses, watching with cruel amusement. Did you really think you could run from me? You're my wife, and you'll come back where you belong. Grace backed away, the clothespin in her hand digging into her palm. No, Frank, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. I'm not going back with you. Frank's face darkened with rage. You don't have a choice, he growled, lunging forward and grabbing her arm with bruising force. Let her go. Mrs. Kricht. Mitchell's voice came from the back door of the boarding house. She held a shotgun aimed steadily at Frank's chest. This girl's under my protection now. Frank laughed, not releasing his grip on Grace. This isn't your concern, old woman. She's my legal wife, and I have the right to take her home. Not when you've beaten her half to death, Mrs. Mitchell replied, her finger steady on the trigger. Now let her go before I put a hole in you that'll make your mama weep. For a moment, tension crackled in the air. Then Frank shoved Grace away from him, making her stumble back against the clothesline. This isn't over, he spat. I'll be back with the sheriff. She's my property by law. Mrs. Mitchell kept the shotgun raised until Frank and his friends had ridden away. Only then did she lower it, turning to Grace with concern in her eyes. Are you all right, child? Grace nodded, though her entire body was trembling. He'll come back, she whispered, and he's right about the law. A husband has rights over his wife. Perhaps, Mrs. Mitchell said grimly, but we have a few days at least. He'll have to ride to the county seat to find a sheriff willing to intervene, and that's a 3-day journey each way. That night, Grace barely slept, haunted by the certainty that Frank would return, that the fragile new life she had begun to build would be shattered. By morning, she had made a decision. I need to leave, she told Mrs. Mitchell over breakfast. Frank will come back, and I can't put you in danger. He's a violent man. Mrs. Mitchell studied her thoughtfully. Where will you go? I don't know, Grace admitted. West, maybe. California or Oregon. Somewhere he won't think to look. That's a dangerous journey for a woman alone, Mrs. Mitchell said. She was quiet for a moment, then added, the cattle drive will be passing back through next week. Samuel and the others will be headed to Cheyenne after that. Perhaps you could travel with them at least that far. The mention of Samuel brought a flutter of something warm to Grace's chest. She had thought of him often in the weeks since he had helped her, wondered if he would truly return as he had promised. Do you think he would help me again? She asked hesitantly. Mrs. Mitchell smiled. That young man has stopped by this boarding house twice a year for the past 5 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you. Yes, I think he would help you. The next week passed with excruciating slowness. Grace jumped at every sound, expecting Frank to appear with the law behind him. But it was Samuel who arrived first, dust-covered and tired from the trail, but with a smile that brightened his entire face when he saw Grace. You're still here, he said, sounding genuinely pleased. And looking much better, if you don't mind my saying so. In truth, despite her anxiety about Frank, Grace had regained some weight, and the constant exposure to fresh air and sunlight while hanging laundry had brought color back to her cheeks. Her hair, which she had washed regularly now that she had access to hot water and soap, hung in soft waves down her back. My husband found me, she blurted out, the fear that had been her constant companion for the past week overwhelming any social niceties. He's gone to bring back the sheriff. I need to leave Riverdale before he returns. Samuel's expression hardened. Did he hurt you? Mrs. Mitchell stopped him, Grace explained. But he'll be back, and the law will be on his side. Samuel nodded gravely. We're heading to Cheyenne day after tomorrow. The trail boss is a good man. He'd let you travel with us if I vouch for you. He hesitated, then added, it won't be comfortable, and it's not exactly proper for a lady to travel with a group of cowboys, but it would be safe. No one would dare harm you with 20 men ready to defend you. I don't care about comfort or propriety, Grace said firmly. I just need to get away before Frank returns. The plan was set. Grace would leave with the cattle drive at dawn 2 days hence, traveling with them to Cheyenne, where she might find passage on a westbound train or wagon train. Mrs. Mitchell helped her prepare, providing a sturdy pair of men's trousers to wear under her skirt for riding and a small bundle of provisions. You've been a blessing to me these past weeks, the older woman told Grace as they said their goodbyes. I hope you find peace wherever you end up. They departed as planned, Grace riding a gentle mare that Samuel had purchased for her, with part of his wages from the cattle drive. She wore her hair braided beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and from a distance might have been mistaken for a young man, which was precisely the intention. The trail boss, a grizzled man named Hank Wilson, had raised an eyebrow when Samuel explained the situation but had given his consent. No trouble on my drive, he warned. First sign of it, and you're both gone. The journey to Cheyenne would take approximately 10 days, following the established cattle trails. Grace learned quickly how to keep up with the drive, staying near Samuel, who patiently taught her the basics of riding properly and caring for her horse. The other cowboys were initially curious about her presence, but soon accepted her as simply another traveler under their protection. On the 4th night, as they sat by the campfire after the evening meal, Samuel finally asked the question she had been expecting. What happened to you? Before I found you on the trail, I mean. Grace stared into the flames, memories washing over her. For a moment, she considered deflecting the question or giving a sanitized version of events. But something in Samuel's steady gaze made her want to speak the truth, however painful. I married Frank when I was 18, she began quietly. My parents had died and I had no family, nowhere to go. He seemed kind at first, attentive even. But after the wedding, everything changed. She told him about the first time Frank had hit her, just 2 weeks into their marriage, when dinner had been slightly overcooked. How the violence had escalated over time, how she had learned to move silently, to suppress every emotion, to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. I lost a baby, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. 2 months ago. Frank said it was my fault, that I was too weak to carry his child. After that, he became worse. He would beat me if I cried about the baby. Said my crying disgusted him. Samuel's face was a mask of controlled anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. No man has the right to treat any living creature that way, least of all his wife, he said, his voice low and fierce. The night I ran away, he told me if I cried again, he'd give me something real to cry about, Grace continued. I knew he meant to kill me. I could see it in his eyes. Samuel was quiet for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then, to her surprise, he reached out slowly and took her hand. His touch was gentle, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. What Frank did to you was evil, he said simply. But you survived. You're stronger than he ever knew. Grace looked down at their joined hands. I don't feel strong. I feel broken. Samuel shook his head. Broken things can be mended. Sometimes they're stronger at the mended places. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. I want you to know something, Grace. As long as I'm breathing, Frank Porter will never hurt you again. That's a promise. She believed him, this quiet cowboy with gentle hands and fierce eyes. For the first time in years, Grace felt truly safe. The days on the trail fell into a rhythm. They rose before dawn, ate a quick breakfast, and rode until midday, when they stopped briefly to rest the cattle and have a cold meal. Then it was back in the saddle until dusk, when they made camp, ate dinner, and took turns standing watch through the night. Grace found herself growing stronger with each passing day. The physical work was demanding, but it was honest labor, not the cowering existence she had known with Frank. Her body, once thin and frail, began to develop muscle from hours in the saddle. Her skin, previously pale from being kept indoors, turned golden from the sun. More than the physical changes, though, was the slow reawakening of her spirit. She found herself noticing the beauty around her, the vast expanse of sky, the rolling hills covered in spring wildflowers, the distant mountains with their snow-capped peaks. And she found herself drawn more and more to Samuel, whose quiet strength and innate kindness were unlike anything she had experienced before. They were a day's ride from Cheyenne when disaster struck. A sudden spring storm blew in from the mountains, bringing with it driving rain and lightning that spooked the cattle. The resulting stampede scattered the herd across miles of terrain, leaving the cowboys scrambling to round up the frightened animals. Grace and Samuel had been riding near the back of the herd when the stampede began. They managed to control their horses and avoid being trampled, but in the chaos, they became separated from the rest of the drive. We need to find shelter, Samuel shouted over the howling wind and rain. There's an old line shack about 2 miles east of here. We can wait out the storm there. They rode through the downpour, the visibility so poor they could barely see 10 feet ahead. By the time they reached the line shack, a crude, one-room cabin used by cowboys monitoring fence lines, they were both soaked to the skin and shivering with cold. The shack was dusty but intact, with a small wood stove, a narrow cot, and a few basic supplies left by previous occupants. Samuel quickly got a fire going in the stove while Grace wrung out her hair and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," Samuel said practically, turning his back to give her privacy. "Wrap yourself in that blanket on the cot. I'll hang your things by the stove to dry." Grace hesitated only briefly before doing as he suggested. The worn woolen blanket was scratchy against her skin but wonderfully warm. Samuel, still facing away from her, held out his hand for her wet clothing, which she passed to him with nervous fingers. "What about you?" she asked, as he arranged her dress and undergarments on a makeshift line near the stove. "I've got a spare shirt in my saddlebag," he replied, still keeping his back turned. "It's a bit damp, but better than what I'm wearing now." He changed quickly, removing his soaked shirt and replacing it with the slightly less wet one from his bag. Even in the dim light of the shack, Grace could see the muscles of his back and shoulders, the result of years of hard physical labor. She looked away quickly, embarrassed by the warmth that flooded her cheeks. The storm raged outside as night fell, the wind howling around the small cabin and rain drumming on the roof. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, the crackling fire in the stove the only sound between them. "What will you do when we reach Cheyenne?" Samuel asked finally, breaking the silence. Grace hugged the blanket tighter around herself. "I'm not sure. Find work, maybe. Save enough for a train ticket further west." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's a sound plan." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. "I've been thinking about California myself. There's good ranching land there, they say. A man could build something worthwhile." "You're not going back to the cattle drives?" Grace asked, surprised. Samuel shrugged. "I've been doing this work for 12 years now. It's a young man's game. Always on the move. No place to call your own." He glanced up at her, then quickly back at the fire. "I've been saving. Have enough to buy a small spread, maybe some breeding stock to start a herd of my own." "That sounds wonderful," Grace said softly, trying to imagine Samuel settled on his own ranch, building something permanent. "It would be," he agreed. "But lonely too, I expect." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Grace's heart began to race, a mixture of hope and fear coursing through her. She had known Samuel for such a short time, yet she felt she understood him better than she had ever understood anyone, including the man she had married. "Samuel," she began hesitantly, "I don't know what's ahead for me. I'm still legally bound to Frank, and I'm damaged by what happened." Samuel moved to sit beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Grace, listen to me," he said, his voice earnest. "What happened to you was not your fault. It doesn't make you damaged. It makes you a survivor." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but for once, she didn't try to hold them back. "When I first met you, you gave me food when I was hungry and protection when I was afraid. No one had shown me kindness in so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like." Samuel reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so as not to startle her, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "The day I found you on that trail, you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. Walking alone, hurt and afraid, but still going forward. I knew then you were someone special." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "That's what makes it brave," Samuel said softly. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Outside, the storm began to abate, the howling wind dying down to a gentle whisper. Inside the small cabin, something delicate and precious was taking root between two people who had both known loneliness. "When we get to Cheyenne," Samuel said carefully, "I'd like to help you get those divorce papers filed. Wyoming's more progressive about such things than most places. And then, if you wanted, you could come to California with me." Grace looked at him with wide eyes. "As what?" Samuel smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "As whatever you want to be. My friend, my partner. Maybe someday. Something more, if that's what you decide. But it would be your choice, Grace. Always your choice. The simple promise of choice of agency over her own life and future moved Grace more deeply than any declaration of love could have. Here was a man offering her freedom first, with the possibility of love to follow, rather than trying to claim her or control her. I think I'd like that, she whispered. To see California. With you. Samuel's smile widened, lighting up his whole face. I hoped you might say that. The morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. They set out early, knowing the cattle drive would have continued toward Cheyenne once the stampede was contained. They rode side by side, comfortable in each other's company, discussing plans for the future. Samuel told her more about his vision for a ranch in California's Central Valley, where the land was fertile and water plentiful. Grace shared her own dreams, simple ones of safety and peace, of maybe having a garden and learning to read better. They had been riding for about 2 hours when they spotted 3 riders approaching from the direction of Cheyenne. Grace felt a chill of premonition even before they were close enough to identify. "It's Frank," she said, her voice tight with fear. "And his friends." Samuel's expression hardened. "Stay behind me," he instructed, moving his horse in front of hers. Frank Porter reined in his horse about 20 feet away, his face twisted in a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like my runaway wife has found herself a new protector." He spat on the ground. "Hand her over, cowboy. She's my property." "No man owns another person," Samuel replied evenly. "Grace isn't going anywhere with you." Frank laughed, an ugly sound. "That's where you're wrong. I've got the law on my side." He gestured to one of the men with him who produced a folded document. "Court order saying she has to return to her lawful husband. Signed by a judge and everything." "Any judge who'd sign such an order without hearing both sides doesn't deserve the title," Samuel said. His hand rested casually near his revolver, a warning Frank didn't miss. "You willing to die for another man's wife?" Frank challenged. "She's not your wife in any way that matters," Samuel responded. "You forfeited any claim to her the first time you raised your hand against her." Frank's face darkened with anger. "She's mine by law and I'm taking her back. That little whore needs to be taught a lesson about running away." He nudged his horse forward. "She always was too quick to cry. I beat her for it every time, told her I'd give her something real to cry about." Samuel's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke again. "You'll never touch her again." "And who's going to stop me? You?" Frank laughed again, looking to his companions for approval. "Yes," Samuel said simply. "Me." What happened next occurred so quickly that Grace barely had time to register it. Frank reached for his gun, but Samuel was faster, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The shot echoed across the open plain as Frank toppled from his saddle, a red stain blooming on his chest. His 2 companions looked from Frank's fallen form to Samuel, whose gun was now trained steadily on them. "That was self-defense," Samuel said calmly. "He drew first. You both saw it. Now you can either join him or you can ride away and never come near Grace Porter again." The men exchanged glances, then slowly raised their hands. "We want no trouble," one of them said. "Frank was the one with the grudge." "Then I suggest you take his body back to wherever you came from and tell people what happened here," Samuel instructed. "And if that court order exists, burn it. Grace Porter is under my protection now." The men nodded, clearly intimidated by the cold precision with which Samuel had acted. They awkwardly loaded Frank's body across his horse and rode away, glancing nervously over their shoulders until they were out of sight. When they were gone, Samuel holstered his weapon and turned to Grace, his expression softening with concern. "Are you all right?" Grace sat motionless on her horse, shock and disbelief warring within her. Frank was dead. The man who had terrorized her for years, who had haunted her nightmares and driven her to flee in fear for her life, was gone. She felt nothing. No grief, no relief, just a strange emptiness. "He's really gone," she whispered. Samuel moved his horse closer to hers and gently took her hand. "Yes, he can never hurt you again." A sob escaped her then, years of pent-up emotion finally finding release. Samuel quickly dismounted and helped her down from her horse, holding her as she cried, his arms providing the safety she had craved for so long. "It's all right," he murmured against her hair. "Let it out. You've held it in far too long." Grace cried until she had no tears left, her body shaking with the force of her release. Samuel held her through it all, his presence solid and unwavering. When she finally quieted, he cupped her face gently in his hands. "Grace, I meant what I said before. Frank's actions were his responsibility, not yours. And your future is yours to choose." He paused, his blue eyes serious. "I care for you deeply, but I want you to be free to make your own decisions now." Grace looked up at this man who had saved her in more ways than one, not just from Frank, but from the despair that had nearly consumed her. "I choose to go with you," she said softly. "To California. To wherever life takes us next." A smile spread across Samuel's face, lighting his eyes with joy. "Then I'll teach you something Frank never could," he promised. "What's that?" Grace asked. "How to laugh again," Samuel said, his voice tender. "How to find joy in simple things, a sunrise, a wildflower, the feeling of rain on your face. How to build a life that's about more than just surviving." Grace felt something unfurl in her chest, something that had been tightly coiled for years, protecting her heart from further harm. With Frank truly gone, with Samuel beside her, she could begin to imagine a future that held more than fear and pain. "I'd like that," she whispered, and for the first time in years, she felt the corners of her mouth lift in a genuine smile. They reached Cheyenne 2 days later, reuniting with the cattle drive on the outskirts of town. Hank Wilson raised an eyebrow when Samuel explained about the confrontation with Frank, but simply nodded and said, "Some men need killing. Sounds like he was one of them." In Cheyenne, they stayed just long enough to confirm that Frank's death had been ruled self-defense based on the reluctant testimony of his companions. With that legal matter settled, Samuel sold the cattle he'd earned as part of his wages from the drive, adding the money to his savings. Grace found work at a hotel while they waited for the next westbound train, earning enough to contribute to their journey. In the evenings, they walked together through the bustling frontier town, making plans for their future in California. Sometimes, to her own surprise, Grace found herself laughing at Samuel's dry observations or smiling at simple pleasures, a particularly beautiful sunset, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of music drifting from a saloon. "See?" Samuel said one evening as they sat on a bench outside their boarding house, watching the stars emerge. "You're remembering how to laugh." Grace leaned against his shoulder, feeling content in a way she had never experienced before. "It's because of you," she said softly. "You showed me that life could be different." Samuel shook his head. "No, Grace. The strength was always in you. You just needed the chance to find it again." A month after arriving in Cheyenne, they boarded a train bound for Sacramento, the first leg of their journey to California. As the train pulled away from the station, Grace watched the Wyoming landscape slide past the window, the place where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. "Are you ready for this?" Samuel asked, his hand warm around hers. Grace turned to him, her heart full. "Yes," she said with certainty. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." Samuel's smile was like sunshine after a storm. "Together," he agreed, and sealed the promise with a gentle kiss. In the years that followed, they built the ranch Samuel had dreamed of, a modest spread in California's fertile valley, with rolling pastures for cattle and horses. Their home was simple but filled with warmth and light, so different from the dark cabin where Grace had once lived in fear. And true to his promise, Samuel taught Grace to laugh again, to find joy in each day. Sometimes the memories of her past would surface, bringing nightmares or moments of panic, but Samuel was always there, patient and understanding, never pushing, but always supporting. 3 years after their arrival in California, they welcomed a daughter, Emma, followed 2 years later by a son they named James. Grace found in motherhood a healing she hadn't known she needed, her heart expanding with love for her children, her determination fierce that they would grow up knowing only gentleness and respect. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, the day Samuel had found her on that lonely trail in Wyoming, he presented her with a small carved wooden box. "What's this?" Grace asked, opening it to find a delicate silver bracelet inside. "5 years ago today, I found the bravest woman I've ever known," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "And every day since then, I've watched you heal, grow stronger, become even more beautiful in spirit." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I never thought I could be happy again," she said softly. "Never imagined I could feel safe enough to love someone, to build a family." "You did that," Samuel insisted, taking her hands in his. "Your courage, your resilience. I just had the privilege of walking beside you." Grace shook her head, smiling through her tears. "We did it together," she corrected, "and that's how we'll face whatever comes next." As the California sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Samuel pulled her into his arms. "Together," he agreed, and his kiss was a promise of all the years still to come. Years filled with challenges, certainly, but also with laughter, love, and the joy of a life well lived. Grace Porter Oakley, once a woman beaten for her tears, had indeed learned to laugh again. And in that laughter was the sound of true freedom, the sweet victory of a spirit that had endured darkness and emerged into light.